To be here with you tonight. I'm going to find my screen. There we go, to share. And I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. Yeah. Oh, how's that looking? Can everyone see this properly? Okay, awesome. So Pollinator Partnership Canada, we are a small but national level conservation charity, and we focus, of course, on pollinators, and we do this through a variety of ways. So we work on the ground doing habitat creation. We collaborate a lot with different groups, whether it's municipalities, corporations, school boards. We sometimes have the chance to conduct primary research, and so conduct actual science. And we also advise on public policy. So we try to achieve our goals of pollinator conservation through a variety of means. And one of them is outreach and education, which is what we're doing tonight. So pollinators, it's a broad group. We usually think of bees, of course, but there are many different animal vectors for pollination. So insects are probably the largest groups, but you find, especially in tropical areas, mammals, birds, and even reptiles that will serve as pollinators. And so basically, when we're talking about pollination, we're of course talking about moving pollen from one bloom to the other, thereby helping plants fertilize their eggs, produce viable seeds, and therefore reproduce. So around the world, there are over 20,000 species of bees. So in North America, we have 4,000 species, and in Canada, we have over 800 and even closing in on 900 species of bees. Most of these bees are native. We have a few non-native species on the continent, notably the honeybee, which is an imported species. Most of our bee species are solitary. That means they don't live in groups the way honeybees do. They lead solitary lives. About 70% of these solitary bees nest in the ground, and the other 30% tend to nest in cavities. So in pithy stems, twigs, in old beetle holes, rodent burrows, or in holes in your shed, or they'll make holes in your shed if they're a carpenter bee. Yeah, so over 4,000 native species in North America, sorry. The smallest ones are called Serratinas or Perdidas. Those are a few different groups of bees. They can be as small as a couple millimeters. And the largest ones we have are the carpenter bees, which is that one in the middle that has its back to us, that's mostly has a shiny black abdomen and is very furry yellow in the middle. So as I mentioned, pollinators essentially help plants reproduce by moving pollen around. So there are a couple ways of looking at this. They're either a pollen taxi, so plants have provided them with rewards, i.e. nectar, to entice them to move this pollen. Or you can consider from a bee's perspective or a pollinator's perspective that they're basically collecting a tax from the flowers basically as an exchange for moving their pollen around. So essentially, it's a way of saying that this is a mutually beneficial relationship for the plants and for the pollinators. But not all organisms that visit flowers are pollinators. Some of them will only drink the nectar, and because of their body shape, won't actually manage to really capture the pollen and bring it to another bloom. I'm missing a couple slides here. I had 100 slides on this and I took out the vast majority of them. So why should we care about pollinators? I'm sure everyone here who's a gardener has their own reasons for that, but broadly why we should care is because they are keystone species. They play a keystone ecological function, which is basically they allow flowering plants to reproduce. And so they basically help us sustain our terrestrial ecosystems. Another reason why we should care, of course, is that they are crucial for our food supply. So this is what our produce choices look like with bees. This is what they look like without bees. So essentially, 1 in every 3 bites of food that we eat is dependent to a certain extent on the pollination services of various animals.
Kathleen, that was a pretty striking photo of what our food looks like, our grocery store would look like without, can you just go back to the one before that, the one
Yeah,
without?
totally.
So there we are with our fully stocked Max Seed
Yeah.
or Previco or Super Seed. And
Yeah.
then the next
So,
one.
yeah. So, what we're not seeing here is we're not seeing apples. We're not seeing berries. We're not seeing any of the squash. We're not seeing tomatoes. We're not seeing cucumbers. And there's other photos in this series that show other sections. So actually, without the pollination services of bees, our choices in dairy products would also be limited, because a lot of the forage, well, I mean, a lot of you guys are farmer. I heard someone was busy with cattle tonight, but a lot of the forage crops for cattle are actually pollinator dependent, such as alfalfa. And so the extent to which any crop is dependent on pollinators varies. So for example, kiwis without pollinators, we'd have our harvest would be 90% smaller. Others, such as that first image, that's canola, that would be impacted up to 25% by a lack of pollination. But of course, pollination doesn't only affect the size of crops, it also affects quality. So the color and the taste of a crop. I'll skip some of these. So let's look a little more closely at these bees. Before I get into that, so I mentioned there are lots of different types of pollinators. Bees are by far the champion pollinators, and that's because they've evolved to collect pollen. So most other pollinators, the beetles, the butterflies, the hummingbirds, the flies, they're really going in to drink nectar. And so they accidentally move pollen around. Bees, on the other hand, they collect pollen intentionally because that's what they feed for their young. So that's what makes them the best pollinators, because their bodies have evolved to capture that pollen. So honeybees, of course, are probably the most recognizable, the best known species of bees there are. There are super organisms. That means you can consider one colony of bees essentially like one organism made up of thousands of different moving parts. So they're a non-native species. They came from Eurasia. And they're a very important agricultural species. They're considered livestock, actually. And that's because they're, as we were just looking at those photos, their prime service is not so much to create honey as it is to pollinate our crops, our commercial crops, as well as our garden crops. There are some concerns around how managed honeybees might impact native pollinators. So in our organizations, we do work with honeybees. We work with beekeepers and doing a mite-a-thon every year, but we really do focus more on wild and native species of bees. So they might be competing for floral resources, they're changing the floral composition, and there's also the risk, because honeybees tend to carry a lot of disease, that there is the risk for these to spill over to wild species of bees just because they're going to be visiting the same flowers. And so some of our staff recently published a review paper on this, on the competition between honeybees and wild species of bees, and it just got an award. So other species of social bees include the bumblebees. So we have close to 40 native species of bumblebees in Canada. I personally really love bumblebees. They're very engaging. They're kind of the fuzzy teddy bears of the bee world. They will nest in rodent burrows on the ground under piles of dead grass or leaves, or in piles of twigs and stems and things like that. So bumblebees, what their life cycle looks like is queens emerge in the spring. They start foraging for nectar to feed themselves, as well as pollen to feed their young. They lay their eggs on their pollen. Those eggs go through a few life cycles, so they become larvae, then the larvae pupate, that's the third life stage, and then the fourth one is they become adult bees. And so those are the workers that then go out, and then they bring pollen back for the queen, who continues to lay eggs. And so that happens over the course of the summer, and then in late summer and fall, the queen starts producing princesses, quote unquote. Those are going to be the future queens, next year's queens, and drones. Those are the males. So the princesses and the drones mate in the fall. The drones die. The young princesses are going to go find a spot to overwinter, usually again in rodent burrows or under piles of leaves and shrubs and things like that. And then they emerge in the spring ready to start their own colony. So these are some examples of places where you might find some bumblebee nests. So we are going to talk at another time about how to maintain gardens for pollinators, but this is this just gives us an idea that it's not a bad thing not to clean your garden too nicely. It's good to leave it a little wild because it does provide habitat for bumblebees, bees, and butterflies. What solitary bees look like, so as I mentioned, there are over 800 species in Canada. Some of them nest in the ground, some of them nest in cavities. And so for those that stem in the cavities of those that nest, in the cavities of nests of twigs and stems, these are some of the key species that help them. So raspberries, elderberries, and sumac, those are all great species to create those pithy stems where you can find bees nesting. So we have 6 large families of bees in Canada. So we have mining bees, which of course nest in the ground like we see here. We have a whole group called the Osmia groups. Those are orchard bees, and this is a very specific species. So if you have apples, you will be seeing some orchard bees, most likely in your blossoms. Sweat bees are also a very common and large group of bees. This one is actually the official bee of Toronto, this sort of metallic sweat bee, the punk rock bee, I like to call it.
Are the bees that you're talking about, sorry, Kathleen, are the bees you're talking about, are they in Quebec as well? Are they across Canada?
Yeah, the vast majority of those we're looking at right now are also found in Quebec.
So that blue bee, that blue bee, that fruit that you said would be on the apple, yes, the blue orchard bee.
Now I'm pretty sure now you're making me question my slides, because there are a few different species of Osmia, and some of them you find in Eastern North America and some of them you find in Western North America. But I do believe the blue orchard bee is an Eastern North American one. Of course, there are leaf cutters, and they're also really interesting. So, oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, my microphone wasn't working. I just wanted to say, if anyone has does anyone have a question before we go on? Because there's just so much information here. Is everybody okay?
Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I have some new people in the waiting room, so I'm just going to let some new people in.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, someone has a question. All right, I'm not quite sure who it is, but
okay.
Can you, your voice is not coming through too well. Could you put it in the chat? Or is that impossible?
Got it.
I have a question, Julie.
Yes, Gwyn has a question. Go, Gwyn.
Yeah, so Kathleen, my project for the gardening club was to make a fantastic raspberry bed with new canes and some old canes I've rehabilitated from the garden. But guess what? I've had one of those bees like nesting, and Julie showed us how it bores around and it makes a little cavity and lays its egg.
That's not a bee.
Oh, that's not a bee?
No, that's a raspberry cane borer.
Okay.
So it's like there can be more than one type of insect burrowing in, but the things that are destroying our raspberry canes or raspberry canes.
Well, I was just going to say, because I haven't cut them all off yet, but I was going to cut them off and sling them. And the bees, they go in old canes, do they, or what?
Yeah, they tend to go into, so actually pruning your raspberries is great. We pruned our raspberries this spring and we have a great crop this year. But you also see the older canes where they've been pruned, where they've dried out. Those are the cavities that the bees can go in. What some people do is in the spring, they'll prune those old twigs, and instead of putting them in, so this might be less relevant out in rural areas, but in the city, people put things in the yard waste bags and send them off. A better thing is to make a pile, and then that'll gives the bees a chance to emerge.
Yeah, that's more likely to happen in my place for sure.
Yeah, so for the most part, so this leaf cutter bee, there's no need to be concerned if you notice bees cutting leaves, cutting holes in your leaves, it doesn't actually damage the plant. Same with the nesting. So if there's any damage from a plant coming from an insect, as far as I know, it's not a bee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a great question. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question who wants to just pop up for a minute or write in the chat? And if you do, if anybody has a question, we're going to keep going, but if you can write it in the chat, that's great, or wait till after the presentation, note it down. Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Please throw in the questions. That's much more interesting than me just going on and on. So carpenter bees, I also wanted to point out because you might actually see them quite often, and they're easy to confuse with the bumblebees. But unlike the bumblebees, they tend to be quite shiny and mostly black on their abdomen, i.e. their butt.
So we actually, sorry, Kathleen, we do have a question. Here's Andrew.
Yeah, please go ahead.
A bit of trouble with the internet connection. So I'll just read his question. So how much of an impact does it have on pollinators to let dandelions grow naturally on the lawn?
Oh, that's a great question. So like a lot of things, it can be a bit complicated. I say go for it. It's often one of the earliest sources of pollen in the spring when not much else is flowering. You'll have the dandelions. There's some concern about some of the nutritional balance in that pollen not being ideal, but I think that's a bit academic at this point. I don't know. I haven't seen any definitive answer. So for my part, I say dandelions play a fine role, especially as an early spring source of food, because that's often one of the sort of driest times of the year for pollinators.
So thanks for the question, Andrew. I had another question. So some bees then, if I understand correctly, are what they call generalists. They'll just sort of take a lot, and some are specific.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, so some species are generalists, exactly as you said. So honeybees are generalists, bumblebees are generalists. Quite a few other species are generalists, and that just means that you'll see them visiting a variety of flowers, and they can make use of the pollen and nectar from many of them. Quite a lot of bees, most species are a lot pickier with their food sources, and that has to do with a few things. So a lot of it might be, essentially all of it has to do with coevolution, but you'll have some species of bees that focus only on a single family of plant. And so the orchard bee is a good example of that. The squash bee is also a great example of that. So as for anyone who's ever grown a large amount of squash, you'll often find them. They're part of the longhorn bee family. You'll find them in the blooms. The males tend to sleep in the flowers to guard the flowers for when the females arrive. But they are a specialist on squash. And so what that means is that there are bees with short tongues, bees with long tongues. There are large bees, medium-sized bees, and small bees. And all these different bee body sizes and lengths of tongues either match or don't match the flowers that are in their landscape. And that's one of the reasons why you'll have specialist bees and generalist bees. So as a gardener, a great thing to do is have as many native plants as you can, as many different colors and shapes and flowering times as you can, because then you support the greatest number of bee species. And you also have a great garden. Okay, so we're gonna fly through this quiz. Don't worry, no one's getting report cards at the end of this. This is really just for fun. So bee, fly, or a wasp. So we haven't really touched on this, but you know, nature is a wondrous thing, and it's there to confuse you in many ways. So bee, fly, or a wasp? Anyone can just chime in. So I think everyone's.
We're muted. I think maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, Gwyneth, yes. This is a robber fly. It's a bee mimic.
It's a fake one, yeah.
It's a fake one, yeah. And so one of the ways you can tell, if you look at its head, flies tend to have eyes on the top of their head, whereas bees tend to have eyes that are on the sides and front. Other tips is it's a lot harder to see. I usually go by the eyes. Flies have one set of wings and bees have two set of wings, but that's a lot harder to see. You usually need a microscope or an unusually still bee. Bee, fly, or wasp?
Anyone want to throw something out there?
A bee?
Yeah, very good.
Let's see
This
it.
is a
That
male bumblebee getting
Yeah.
a drink of nectar. So as you can see, his eyes are a little more on the side than the fly we were just looking at. Bee, fly, or wasp?
That's a wasp.
A wasp.
Was.
It's a trick question. This is actually a bee, but
Really?
it's a parasitic bee. It's a cuckoo
Yes.
bee. That means it's basically does what most other wasps do, which is goes and lays its egg in another bee's nest and gets the other bee to raise its young. Or that's one form of parasitism. But this, yeah, it's a bee that looks like a wasp.
Wow.
Bee, fly, or wasp?
Fly.
This is
Agreed.
actually this is actually a small bee, a very small bee. This is a sweat bee. So one of the ways, again, the eyes are on the side instead of on the top of its head. And as opposed to flies, it has a more distinct separation between the thorax and abdomen, so between the top and the bottom part of its body.
And the antennas also? Is that a part more?
Yes, very good. The antenna. So bees, they tend to have slightly longer antenna, and there's also a little segment. So you see how it's a bit bent early on. So that segmentation is typical of bees and wasps, just to confuse, but not flies. Bee, fly, or wasp?
Fly.
Yeah, yes, excellent, very well. So
Wasp.
again, the eyes are on the top of the head,
Mhm.
got only one set of wings, and it's meant to look like a bee to confuse potential predators, most likely. Bee, fly, or wasp?
Fly.
Yeah, good one. Hey, you guys are getting really good at this. So yeah, again, this is another bee mimic. It's a fly that's meant to look like a bee.
Very
Bee,
fluffy.
fly, or wasp?
Wasp. Ant.
Wasp.
Wasp.
I say wasp.
This is actually
wasp.
also a bee that does look a lot like a wasp. It's a yellow-faced bee. It's in the Hylaeus genus.
Can it be that they mate between each other and it makes that?
Not that I know, but interesting tidbit. Wasps evolved before bees. So bees came from wasps, essentially. A long, long time ago. Bee, fly, or wasp?
It's a bow. Looks like a bee.
Yeah, very good. This is one of my favorite ones. I find it very cute. It's a long-horned bee. As you can see, it's got especially long antenna. And it's got those very characteristic, this species has very characteristic sort of gray eyes of this tawny color. I see them out on my garden on my sweet ox-eye flower quite a bit. So they like cone flowers. Bee, fly, or wasp?
Waspish.
I
I
say
think
wasp.
so.
Yeah, wow.
I kind of forget, actually. I think that's a wasp. Oh, wait, no, that's a bee. That looks like a wasp.
Yeah.
And this,
That
you
looks
guys
like
know this one.
That's a wasp that looks like a bee.
A wasp.
Yeah, that's, this is the yellow jacket. Those are the aggressive non-native wasps. That,
Ones we hate.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
Yes.
on elderflower, right?
So I have a
oh, good
question.
color, mate.
I
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I have a, so how can you tell wasps from bees?
Great question. So again, as I've just shown you in this quiz, it's complicated out in nature, but there are a few like really basic things. The two things that I usually use as a quick categorizer is wasps tend to be shinier and less hairy than bees. So the hair, the fur on the bees, that's meant to capture pollen. The wasps don't collect pollen, they just drink the nectar. So they don't have that need for the hairs. The other thing is wasps tend to have a much smaller waist, essentially. It's not a waist, but the space between their top part of the body and the bottom, so between the thorax and the abdomen, is much smaller. So as you can see in this one, you really see two distinct body parts.
Like an extreme hourglass figure.
Exactly. Yeah. So now let's just roughly talk about pollinator decline. So earlier I asked why should we care, and we talked about the importance of pollinators for ecosystems, including our own food production. The other reason why we should care is because they are facing some very serious threats and challenges, and that's we call that pollinator declines. So you're probably all very familiar with monarchs. They're beautiful, iconic, multi-generational, cross-continental migrating butterfly. And we have seen some very worrying trends since we started monitoring their numbers in the mid-90s. And essentially, we've seen population reductions over 80%. And so they're listed as a species under threat. They are part of a tri-national conservation agreement between Mexico, the US, and Canada. And of course, they have a very special host plant. So most butterflies have a plant or a family of plants that their caterpillars depend on to develop. And in the monarch's case, it's the milkweed family. And so one of the main theories as to why we have seen this decline in monarchs is that there are fewer and fewer milkweeds in North America, and in particular in the Midwest. And this does coincide with the use of glyphosate, i.e. Roundup, which was introduced in the mid-90s. And basically that just wipes out your milkweed, but not only your milkweed, but the other flowering plants that monarchs and other animals and wildlife depend on for pollen, nectar, and food sources. We've seen bumblebee declines across North America. So in Ontario, there used to be a very common species called the rusty patch. And since 2009, it has not been seen, despite the fact that people are out looking for it. And
just to say that, underline that that was equally common in Quebec.
Oh, thank you for that. I was
well.
wondering.
Yeah.
So
and I think I think it's been, it was seen more recently in Ontario, and I think it hasn't been seen in Quebec for a very long time, although Quebec and Ontario had different ways of keeping keeping records. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thank you for that insight. So this is a study of 8 species in the US, including the rusty patch. But basically what this shows is, and I won't ask you to analyze the data on the maps, but basically what it shows is of these 8 species, most of them have seen both range contractions and population contractions. So what that means is you find fewer of them in fewer places. And so a few of these species, including the rusty patch, their numbers have been reduced by 96%. So that's a drastic thing. So they're on the brink of extinction, basically. So that's what we know about bumblebees. I'll go back. We know a lot less about the solitary bees. So we don't know that much about most of our bee species. And same is true for most of our flies, most of our beetles, most of our butterflies. And that's just because they're a lot harder to study than some of the larger, more social species like bumblebees. But where we have done studies, what we're seeing is, like most wildlife around the world, we are going through the 6th major extinction. This is the era of the Anthropocene. There have been studies coming out of nature reserves in Germany, in Costa Rica, where there is no logging, where there's no industrial activity. These are nature reserves. And the numbers of insects there have declined since the 70s in very significant proportions. So what's behind this? And this is a sort of big picture topic. There are lots of reasons. It's a bit of a perfect storm. Each of these reasons amplifies all of the others. So land use intensification. This covers both habitat loss and pesticide use. That means we're making our landscapes less hospitable for wildlife, and in this case, pollinators especially. So both in the countryside and in cities and in suburbs, we're losing habitat, natural habitat. The sort of mixed human-like landscapes are becoming more simple. So agriculture used to support a wider variety of wildlife because the fields were smaller. Glyphosate is a recent addition, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have new pesticides, the systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids. And so all of those things we put under land use intensification. Basically means there are fewer places for pollinators to live and survive. Alien species, this is mostly, we refer to invasive plant species that are either crowding out the native species that pollinators depend on or otherwise affecting the ecosystem in certain ways that have impacts on bees, butterflies, et cetera, et cetera. Diseases, so one of the interesting things is that honeybees, they have a lot of diseases. They're a managed species. They are in high volumes, kept in high volumes, and through commercial pollination contracts, they travel a lot, and a lot of them end up in the same places where disease can spread. And then disease spreads fairly easily between bee species, and that's just for genetic reasons. But as I mentioned earlier, a sick bee of one species visiting a flower, that can transmit a disease or a parasite to another bee of a different species. And then of course, climate change. So I'll go into more detail about all of these. Oh yeah, sorry, so I skipped ahead. So habitat destruction and fragmentation. So these are just some visuals.
Wow.
So when you're a bee,
Hold on, Kathleen, sorry, 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, there's so much information just in the slide that you gave us before. There's so much to think about. So each of them are big issues. I'm just wondering if anyone has a comment or anybody has a question at this stage. Just check in with everybody. How's everybody doing? Okay, no comments and questions? Good. Okay,
I
so
have a question.
yes.
Alien species. What does she mean by alien species?
yeah, so these are species that are not native to this ecoregion. And so that would be, so in this picture, we see something called garlic mustard. And as you can see, this is a forest. And so the underground, the understory of this forest has one species that we can see right now, and it's all garlic mustard and nothing else.
Mm.
This is an unhealthy forest. Garlic mustard.
So what you mean is we need to diversify in one spot?
Yeah, so alien species, it's a bit complicated because usually these are plants that, because they haven't evolved here, when they arrive, not all of them, definitely not all of them, but some of them just find a niche and they have what are called novel weapons. So this is all like ecological speak. It just means that they're able to get a toehold in and push out other species of plants.
I think a good example for gardeners is something we were talking about several years ago is purple loosestrife. And that was a really showy, spiky purple flower that was just taking over and make like millions of seeds.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a flower on a vine?
No, it's a spiked flower. I'll put a picture up on the Facebook group for now, later on. But Andrew has a really good question here, which I'll echo. He wants to know, what are some practical things that we can do to help support pollinators in our gardens? So.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I can skip ahead because we did talk about doing a big picture thing.
Yeah.
So let me skip ahead because let's get to the practical stuff.
Yeah.
Habitat, talking about pesticides. Okay, yeah, this is way too many details.
Yeah, we know when we feel terrible. We know when we feel terrible about the bees because we're gardeners and we're gentle souls.
Yes, I love
active people. So
okay.
Yeah, so what can we do?
Thanks for your question, Andrew. Let's cut to the chase. And indeed, what can we do? The great news is that unlike caribou, which require tens of thousands of kilometers of tundra for their survival, we as gardeners, even if we only have a small balcony downtown, especially if we have a larger garden in the suburbs or out of the country, there's so much that we can do. And that's because bees are small, they're mobile, and we can plant the plants that they need to survive. So really, and I didn't go into a lot of detail because we're going to do this another time, but let's talk about it. Let's do questions. Basically,
sorry, just to follow up on that for everybody, I did ask Kathleen to come back, perhaps maybe late fall or early winter when we're planning our garden, because there is a lot that we can do in terms of choosing plants and that. But you know, a lot of us already have our gardens planted, so that's why I want Kathleen to go into more detail with that. So that's coming up for everybody just to know. Okay.
Great. So first and foremost, create habitat. And as gardeners, you are most likely already doing that. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a few principles that can help us figure out how to do this. So I like to call it the 3x3 principle. So that means having at least 3 flowering plants for each of the 3 seasons. So 3 different species blooming in spring, 3 different ones in summer, and 3 different ones in late summer, early fall. And actually, just a quick question. Is everyone familiar with the concept of native plants?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Should I go over that in more detail? Okay, I see a few yeses, I see some no's. So native plants are plants that have an evolutionary history in the area where you're gardening. So there are 2 ways that we usually define this: either plants, species that have been present since the last little glacial period, which was 12,000 years ago approximately, or plants that were here before European colonization. And that's just a shorthand way of saying these are plants that have relationships with everything else around them. Mm. And when we're talking about specialist bees or host plants for butterflies, they've evolved together. So when we plant these native plants, we're not only making a pretty garden, we're making an ecologically functional garden. And that's really, I cannot stress enough, if you want to support wildlife with your garden, go native. And I highly recommend checking out Doug Tallamy. He's a researcher in the States. He does a bunch of TED Talks. He's written great books. He goes into all the details, but one example is oaks. Oaks are really important trees for wildlife, but not oaks from England. As beautiful as they are, they don't have those relationships with the wildlife here. But the group of native oaks in North America that we find in Ontario and Quebec, the white oaks, the chinkapin oaks, the bur oaks, as a group, they support over 500 different species of butterflies and moths. Birds mostly eat caterpillars and insects, especially the young. When you plant a native oak, you are providing a food source for birds. And so it's this whole domino effect going in. And again, native oaks, native shrubs, native trees and native shrubs, they're actually one of the earliest sources of pollen and nectar, mostly pollen in the spring. So when there are no flowers around, shrubs are blooming like willows. And you will see lots and lots of bumblebees on willows, native willows that are blooming on maples, etc. So that's the food part, the pollen and the nectar. Use native plants, use a diversity of bloom times, a diversity of shapes, a diversity of colors. You're going to cover a lot of ground. That's the food. Now, the nesting part, the shelter part, that's where, as a gardener, you can take a step back, work a little less hard, have a garden that looks a little wilder. It doesn't need to be super manicured. You're doing yourself a favor. You're also doing a huge favor to the wildlife. So having bunching grasses, leaving dead wood around, including snag trees. So basically trees that are dead, that are defoliated, those are huge habitat centerpieces. Piles of twigs in a back corner of your garden, piles of leaves, mulching your garden with leaves. Most butterflies will spend winter as a cocoon in piles of leaves. That's where they spend winter. So when we leave leaves in our garden, we are providing a space for butterflies to survive winter. We mentioned most of our solitary bee species nest in the ground. Mulch is great I use mulch in my garden. I also leave spots of bare soil, and especially if it's well drained, south facing sloped soil. You know, this is getting a little technical, but if you want some tips, if you've got a spot that meets those conditions, that is going to be a preferred spot for your ground nesting bees to go. So use mulch to suppress weeds, to keep moisture, etc., etc. But if you can leave some spots of bare soil, that will be appreciated by a lot of wildlife, and particularly the ground nesting bees. Yeah. So those are some practical things.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've been seeing like little houses for bees that are made with different kinds of holes for insects and so on. So that's probably a good thing, I imagine.
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. And this is a hard one to answer. Pardon?
Are you familiar with those little kind of houses for bees?
Yes, yes, very much. I think I stopped sharing my screen. Sorry, that was an accident. But essentially, it's a good idea, but the devil's in the details. That's the answer. So there are two things. A lot of these bee houses are not long enough. So insider information, when female bees lay their eggs, they'll usually lay several eggs in one cavity, and each one will have its own cell. Some of them will line them with leaves, others will line them with soil, some of them secrete a kind of almost like a cellophane membrane. But in this cavity, they lay the females at the back and the males at the front of the tube. And that is basically insurance for predation. So in other words, that means if you've got a woodpecker coming, and I've seen this in my own mom's garden in her Costco bee house, the woodpecker goes right in, takes out all the larvae they can reach.
Oh.
It's not as huge of an expense to lose the males, but it costs a lot more to lose the females, because the females are the one that are going to be, you know, creating the next generation. So you can get away with having just one surviving male, but you need a lot of females. So the problem with these often too short cavities, these tubes, is it skews the sex ratio, and also it makes the larvae that are in there much more prone to predation. So that's one big problem. They're usually too short, too wide. The other problem is that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of bee diseases. There are also a lot of bee parasites. And unless you can clean these cavities or replace them annually, there's a risk of transmitting these diseases from year to year. So this is a burning question. I'm so glad that you asked it, Joy. What we're actually working on, this is one of my tasks for our summer intern, is to do all the research on bee homes, and we are creating a website page with all the instructions on what are the best choices are and how to do it yourself and how to clean them. So that's going to be up in the next month.
Good, good.
Yeah, that's great. This might be a good opportunity to tell everyone that to take a look at the Pollinator Partnership Canada website. Yeah. There are tons of information, and what I found is they've actually made publications on native plants and bees per region. So you can download a booklet. We have two regions actually here. We have the Trois-Rivières, Drummondville, Montreal, Quebec region, and then we also have Shawinigan, which is a separate region. So
yes, thank you so much for that. So this is like, as Julie just said, you can find this on our website. It's pollinatorpartnership.ca, and go to resources. These are the eco-regional guides. So it covers a lot of what we just discussed, the kind of things you want to do in your garden to create habitat. It also gives you a list of the native plants in your area that support pollinators. We have these for both ecoregions that your administrative region covers, and we have them in French and in English.
Yeah, it's a really great resource, a really great resource. And so there's so much information. So to download these guides, you can take your time, you can sit down with them, you can refer to them and go back to them. Julia has a question. Julia, how's your microphone working? Would you like to ask it, or would you like me to read it?
You go ahead and read it. That's fine.
it. Okay, so Julie's wondering, she's been thinking of making a bug hotel. So is that a good or bad idea considering the disease issue? Because they seem to be a big thing in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea if you can commit to cleaning it annually and you have the right size instructions. So that's what we're working on, and that's the thing that we'll have up on our website in the next few weeks. You can, before that's up, you can also do some research. There's a lot of great information out there, but I would say always look at the source. You know, like any information on the internet, don't take the first recommendation you see just because it's popular. If the extension is .edu or .org, there's often a higher likelihood that it's quality information. But I would say just quickly, make sure that you can clean it. That can be, if you're using a tube that you want to keep, roll some paper and put the paper in so that you can take it out after. Make sure that the tubes are at least 15 centimeters long and between 1 millimeter and 10 millimeters wide. And make sure that ideally this is fixed so it's not moving around and it's facing the southeast and it's protected from the wind and the rain. So those are like overall the main things to keep in that. So is it a good idea? It can be if you can commit to all of those things.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so maybe we can just, we'll stop sharing screens so that we can have everyone together, and here we go, because it's so hot. This has been a great presentation. Thank you so much.
I realize I just went like seriously overtime. There's just so much
there's
to
so
share
much,
about
there's
this.
so much to share. Yeah,
So
for sure,
much.
that's okay. It's okay.
I felt like it just passed in like 5 minutes. Like I'm just like,
Okay.
I'm like, holy smokes, that went fast. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
Any other comments? Anybody else? Comments or questions?
Questions, yeah.
Kathleen?
Well, I just have one thing to say, that it's all very well having these bees nesting in the ground and that, but if you start gardening and don't realize that you're just going over their home. So, okay, then maybe you can tell me, the ones that shoot out and are extremely angry, are they bees or wasps?
Usually, if they're aggressive, they're usually wasps.
Okay.
A lot. So
wasps do that too. Wasps go in the ground.
Yeah, wasps do go in the ground. So it's a great question. Thank you for the question, Gwyneth. Most bees that are solitary, you really have to threaten them for them to sting you. And most of them, especially the smaller they get, their stingers aren't really strong enough to pierce through skin. That being said, I've gotten in my life all the poking around in plants and photographing and touching bees. I've only ever gotten stung once, and I was feet away from flowers and I was just drinking a drink on a chair, and it somehow ended up in my skirt and stung me. But that was the only time. But that being said, yeah, most bees can't and won't sting. And the big reason is, unlike honeybees, like a honeybee worker is very expendable. It will die to protect its hive. A solitary bee, you know, if it dies, it's not passing on its genetics. So the threat needs to be way higher for there to be any stinging.
I think that's so interesting about the fact that there are these solitary bees. I never considered that there were solitary bees, and I never considered that they lived in the ground. And it makes sense suddenly, because we're on a farm, and when my kids were little, sometimes their feet would be stung suddenly, and they would step on a bee, and we were wondering, well, we never saw the bee. What was the bee doing? And perhaps the bee was just crawling out.
It could be ants. It could be wasps.
Oh, it was a bee.
It could be, it was a bee.
These were bees. Yeah, they were
like
bees.
Honeybees.
No, they were more like a bumblebee type of bee.
Oh, okay.
And anyway, I just wonder if that's what they were.
Should have been a fake bee, Julie.
Yeah, and well, now I'm totally confused. Here I was thinking that I knew.
When we do encounter a wasp, or a wasp nest, is there any benefit to not having that removed?
Good question. It's so context dependent. I've never had a wasp nest. Oh wait, no, that's not true. I have had one wasp nest, and I think we kind of dealt with it. I kind of forget. I think definitely if it's anywhere near your door or places that you go a lot, if you've got kids, anyone who has any kind of allergy, yes, get rid of it. If it's someplace that you can coexist peacefully, I have so many different wasps in my gardens, lots of different kinds of wasps. I've never gotten stung by a wasp. My raspberry bush was covered in all kinds of life forms, including many wasps. I was right there with my camera taking photos of everything I could, and I was never stung. So I think it's a personal question to a certain extent. I think most of the time, if it's not actively bothering anyone, not doing any damage, I'd leave it.
Yes, and as a gardener too, a lot of wasps prey on garden pests.
Yeah, so wasps,
so you don't want to get rid of wasps.
They're a bit of an indicator. If you have quite a few wasps, and also this gets, it depends on the species, et cetera, but wasps are parasites. So when you have parasites, it can be an indicator that you have a healthy ecosystem because you need enough things to parasitize to sustain a population of parasites.
That's a really good question. I've got some questions in the chat. One from Sophia. I know, Sophia, your microphone isn't working too well, so I'll read it for you. So Sophia was saying that she was thinking of having honeybees in the future, but is wondering now whether she shouldn't do that to not harm the native bees.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Sophia. Okay, yes, thank you. That's such a great question. The answer for me personally, and as a conservation professional, is why do you want to have bees? If the answer is because you love honeybees, you want to enjoy honey, you want to enjoy the act of beekeeping, and you can ensure that you're taking good care of your bees, I would say go for it and enjoy it fully. And on top of that, just add as many flowers, and we have a honeybee forage guide that lists all kinds of different species of both native and non-native plant that are beneficial for honeybees. If you can cover that and your reason is because you love honeybees, you want honey, go for it. If you want to have honeybees because you want to help save the bees, then I say don't get honeybees or change your reason to get honeybees. Getting honeybees to help save the bees is like getting a cow to save the caribou. They're just not in need of conservation help because they're not wild, they're managed by humans, and they are a non-native species. So honeybees do have problems, but getting honeybee hives doesn't address what those problems are. The problems around genetics, breeding, commercial trucking of bees, poor stock management, and pests and diseases. And so those are not issues that can be addressed by individuals having a few hives as a hobby. But as I said, the question depends really on why you want to have bees.
That's a great answer.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that.
Thanks, Sophia. And Julia just had a comment in the chat. I'll let you share that if you want, Julia.
It's just I've noticed I really worked hard last year, as Susan can attest, that I took a lot of milkweed, nice stuff, and spread it all over everywhere. Like I just spread the seeds everywhere, and I got really a lot of milkweed this year. So I'm ecstatic. Except I haven't seen the honey. We do have honeybees on our land. I don't see them in my garden now. They're just in the milkweed. And I'm like, oh, so I don't know, I don't know. I think I should be happy, but I don't know if I'm happy or not.
So you see the honeybees on your milkweed, but the milkweed is not in your garden?
Right, my milkweed, like I have fields, and so I just plant, it's natural native milkweed, so I just wanted to have more of it. So I had a few plants, so I took all the nice moussey stuff, the fluffy stuff with the seeds attached, and I just spread it everywhere along my canals and the fields, and so I got a lot. I'm really excited about that. But now this year compared to last year, I'd be working in my garden, you know, trimming my tomato plants, and here comes Mr. Bee, and I'm like, oh, I like Mr. Bee. This year I don't have that at all. They're just in my milkweed. So
Okay, that's such an interesting observation. I mean, I don't know the particular reason. It could be that they just really like milkweed pollen and nectar, or
okay.
mostly pollen nectar. That could be it. So, yeah, I don't.
It's an interesting question, because it's hard to know if you don't have data to compare it to. Is it maybe, are there less bees in general this year?
Yeah.
You know, maybe they're affected by the weather, maybe they're affected by the dryness.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And that's another huge
They are-
one.
Sorry, Julia?
No, I was just saying they are affected by the weather this year. Because I have a beekeeper. That's his life work. He's a beekeeper, and he finds people like us that we don't have pesticides or anything sprayed on the fields here. So he finds people like us that are doing sort of organic everything, and he brought his hives, 12 hives. So, and he checks them, and he comes and takes care of them, and at the end it's a swap. He gives me honey. So, yeah.
Oh, that's
But
an
he
awesome
told
thing.
us-
Yeah, I have friends who are
told us-
beekeepers as well, and they lost all their hives last winter. They're not even keeping bees this year. They decided
Oh, that's sad. Yeah, sorry.
bad winter. And I wonder if the winter was particularly drawn out. I lost a lot of plants because they actually survived the winter, but then we had those really cold spells in March and April with ice and rain freezing down a good depth. So maybe that affected the bees that were starting to emerge as well. Who knows?
Yeah, there's a lot of variation from year to year. And so part of the challenge as a researcher is to see the trends in the noise.